The first sign was not the army. It was the sound of wood. Heavy beams dragged across stone. Iron brackets slammed into place. Chains tightened, link by link. The gates were closing. Inside the city, people stopped what they were doing and listened. They always listened, because once the gates shut, nothing came in, and nothing left. A medieval siege did not begin with violence. It began with waiting. Waiting for the last cart to pass through the gate. Waiting for the guards to finish counting heads. Waiting for the city to seal itself from the world. Some people made it inside just in time. Others did not. Those left outside would not be mentioned again. Inside the walls, the city changed immediately. Markets closed early. Stalls were dismantled and carried indoors. Animals were pulled from the streets and locked behind doors. People understood what this meant. The siege was not an event. It was a condition. At first, there was order. City officials walked the streets, shouting instructions. Food was inventoried. Wells were guarded. Storehouses were locked and marked. Bread was weighed carefully. Grain was measured again and again. Everything was counted. Because from this moment on, every mistake would be permanent. People told themselves it would not last long. Most sieges didn't, at least not in the beginning. Days. Weeks, at most. The attackers would get bored, or run out of money, or move on. This belief was important. It kept panic from spreading too early. At night, the city was quieter than usual. No one wanted to waste candles. No one wanted to attract attention. From the walls, guards watched fires flicker in the distance. Enemy camps glowing softly like constellations on the ground. The city was surrounded. Not attacked. Just watched. This was the most unsettling part. Nothing happened. No arrows. No shouting. No assault. Just waiting. And waiting does something strange to people. Inside houses, families whispered plans they would never act on. How long the food would last. Who should eat less? What could be sold if it came to that? Children were told stories to keep them calm, but the stories grew shorter each night. Adults listened to the sounds outside instead. The city bell rang differently now, not to announce hours, not to call people to prayer. It rang to remind everyone of restraint. Eat less. Burn less. Move less. The bell did not comfort. It disciplined. After a few days, the first rules appeared. No private baking. No slaughtering animals without permission. No hoarding. Food belonged to the city now. Those caught hiding supplies were punished publicly. Not because the city was cruel, but because fear spread faster than hunger. People still believed the walls would protect them. Stone was solid. Towers were tall. Gates were strong. They had survived raids before. But a siege was different. A siege did not test the walls. It tested the people. The attackers did not need to break in. They only needed to wait. And they were very good at waiting. By the second week, the city smelled different. Not rot, not yet. But tension. Sweat lingered longer. Waste piled higher. Water tasted stale. Wells were used more carefully now. Buckets were inspected. Guards watched for anyone tampering with the water. Poison was a real fear. Not because it happened often, but because once was enough. At night, people began to dream of food. This was always the first sign. Dreams of bread, of meat, of full bowls and careless eating. They woke up ashamed of these dreams. Ashamed but hungry. The city council met daily. They argued quietly. How long supplies might last. Whether to ration harder now or later. Whether surrender should be discussed. That word, surrender, was never spoken aloud. Not yet. From the walls, defenders watched the enemy build. Not weapons. Structures. Shelters. Storage pits. Cooking fires. The attackers were settling in. This would not be quick. At night, sounds carried. Laughter from the camps. Music, sometimes. The clatter of armor. Inside the city, silence answered. No one sang anymore. Children stopped playing in the streets. Parents kept them indoors, even during the day. Not because the streets were dangerous, but because play looked wrong now. Joy felt inappropriate. The first deaths inside the city had nothing to do with fighting. An old man collapsed in the street. A child fell ill and did not recover. A woman died in her sleep. Normal deaths. But during a siege, nothing feels normal. Each loss felt like subtraction. The city kept count, not officially, but everyone did the math. How many mouths left? How much food saved? Death became a calculation. At night, people listened for different sounds now. Not enemies. Rats. They came out early during sieges. Drawn by waste. Drawn by stillness. They moved freely through streets that once belonged to people. The guards on the walls changed shifts more often. Fatigue was dangerous. A moment of inattention could end everything. But exhaustion accumulated anyway. Sleep was shallow. Dreams were restless. No one talked about what would happen if the walls were breached. That thought was sealed away. People focused on smaller fears. Tomorrow's ration. Tonight's noise. The creak of wood in the dark. This was how sieges really began. Not with blood, but with shrinking space, shrinking choices, shrinking hope. And this was only the beginning. Because once the city adjusted to being trapped, the real siege began inside the walls. Hunger does not arrive suddenly. It enters quietly, like a guest who plans to stay. At first, it is only an adjustment. Smaller portions. Longer pauses between meals. A careful chewing meant to make food last longer than it should. People told themselves they were fine. They were not starving. Not yet. The city announced rationing before hunger demanded it. Bread was marked and measured. Grain was distributed by weight, not need. Meat became rare, then ceremonial, then a memory. Those with money discovered it meant nothing now. There was nothing to buy. Those with power learned its limits. You cannot command food into existence. Markets reopened briefly, only to close again. Stalls stood empty. Prices rose until numbers lost meaning. A loaf of bread could cost a week's wages, and still not be available. Money became paper. Food became currency. Families adjusted in different ways. Some ate together, sharing what little remained. Others separated meals to hide how small they had become. Parents skipped portions quietly. Children noticed anyway. They always did. Cooking changed. Soups replaced bread. Water replaced soup. Anything that could be boiled was boiled. Anything that could be softened was softened. Flavor disappeared first. The city issued new rules. No feeding animals. No wasting scraps. No private slaughter. Pets vanished quickly. No one asked where they went. At night, hunger grew louder. Stomachs made sounds that felt shameful. Sleep became harder. Dreams returned, more vivid now. People dreamed of eating without counting. They woke angry at themselves. Hunger changes how people think. Patience thins. Irritation sharpens. Small arguments became serious. Serious arguments became dangerous. The city responded with punishment. Public punishment. Because fear was still cheaper than food, the wells became the city's most valuable places. Guards stood watch day and night. Buckets were counted. Water use was restricted. No baths. No washing unless necessary. The city began to smell. Not rot yet, but closeness. Too many people. Too little space. Illness followed quickly. Not plague. Not yet. Simple infections. Cause that lingered. Ones that refused to heal. Hunger weakens quietly. Bodies grew thinner. Faces sharper. People recognized the look. They had seen it before. Doctors had nothing new to offer. Herbs were rationed like food. Bloodletting continued out of habit, not hope. Illness became something to endure, not cure. The city council argued again. Some wanted harsher rationing now. Others wanted to save supplies for later. No one knew which choice was right. Every decision felt like gambling with lives. Outside the walls, the enemy waited. They watched smoke rise thinner each day. They counted fewer movements on the battlements. They did not need spies. Hunger leaves signs. Inside, people began to trade secrets. Where food might be hidden. Which households still had reserves. Who was eating better than they should. Trust eroded. Neighbors watched each other more closely. The city tried to enforce unity. Meetings were held. Prayers were organized. Public speeches were given. They helped briefly. Then hunger returned. It always did. Children were affected first. Their energy vanished. Their play became slow, then stopped. Parents told them to rest. Rest did not help. Some people attempted escapes. At night, quietly, most failed. The walls were high. The guards were alert. Those caught were punished publicly, not to be cruel, but to prevent others from trying. Hunger makes people practical. People stop talking about honor, about pride, about victory. They talked about survival, how long the city could last, what could be eaten next. Rats multiplied. They were bold now. They moved through streets openly, unafraid. People hunted them at first, then stopped. Rats were food. No one admitted it, but everyone knew. The first confirmed cases of starvation appeared quietly. An old woman found dead in her bed. A man collapsing during guard duty. The city recorded the deaths, then adjusted the rations again. At night, the silence changed. It was heavier now, not tense. Tired, the city was exhausted. The attackers noticed. They did nothing. They waited. Hunger does not kill everyone at once. It kills slowly, unevenly. It selects. The sick first, the young, the old, those with injuries, those with responsibilities. The city watched itself shrink. People stopped asking how long it would last. They started asking who would still be alive when it ended. This was the phase when sieges were won, not by force, but by time. And time was on the attacker's side, because hunger does not need to hurry. It always arrives eventually. Time pressed inward from every direction. Each day inside the city felt longer than the last, yet somehow accomplished less. People woke up tired, went to sleep tired, and carried that exhaustion with them even in dreams. Nothing changed, and that was the problem. The walls still stood. The gates were still closed. The enemy was still there. But the city was slowly losing something far more important than stone or strength. It was losing rhythm. At first, days had structure. Morning ration distribution, guard shifts, council meetings, evening prayers. But hunger disrupted routine. People overslept because there was nothing worth waking up for. Guards grew careless. Meetings ended in silence instead of arguments. When routine breaks, discipline follows. And when discipline weakens, everything else collapses quietly behind it. Time changed how people perceived risk. Early in the siege, every sound on the wall mattered. Every movement outside was watched closely. Now, fewer people bothered, not because the threat was gone, but because vigilance requires energy. And energy was gone. The city began to experience something worse than hunger, hopelessness. Not panic, not fear, just a heavy certainty that nothing would improve tomorrow. Hope had been rationed away long ago. People stopped planning. No more discussions about what would happen after the siege. No rebuilding. No future marriages. No dreams beyond survival. Life narrowed to hours. If you could eat today, that was enough. Children noticed the change in adults. Parents became quieter, less patient, less present. Stories stopped halfway through. Promises were no longer made. Children learned something important and terrible. Adults did not know what to do. Illness accelerated now, not because of a single disease, but because bodies no longer resisted anything. Minor cuts festered. Simple coughs lingered for weeks. Fevers came and went unpredictably. Doctors walked from house to house, offering words instead of cures. Words were cheaper than medicine. The smell of the city shifted again. This time it was unmistakable. Waste accumulated faster than it could be removed. Bodies were buried shallowly, or not at all. There was no ceremony anymore. Death was handled efficiently. Time also reshaped morality. Acts that would once have been unthinkable became understandable. Stealing food from a neighbor, lying about rations, hiding illness to avoid isolation. People judged less. Everyone was doing something they would have condemned before. The city tried to respond with law. Curfews were tightened. Punishments grew harsher. But enforcement weakened. Guards were hungry too. Arguments turned into fights. Fights turned into injuries. Injuries turned into deaths. The city was now hurting itself faster than the enemy ever could. Outside the walls, the attackers noticed all of this. They saw fewer guards on the towers, slower movements, longer delays in response. They adjusted nothing. They did not need to. Time favored them because time stripped choice away from the city. Eventually, only bad options remained. Eat now or starve later. Fight now or surrender later. Hold on or give up. Every choice cost lives. The council met again. This time, surrender was spoken aloud. Not as defeat, but as preservation. Better to lose the city than lose everyone inside it. The room was quiet. No one disagreed, but surrender takes time too. Negotiations, messengers, delays, time the city did not have. Meanwhile, the population continued to shrink. Not dramatically, quietly. Each morning revealed a few more empty spaces. A bed unused, a door unopened. Loss blended into the background. The city bells rang less often now. There was no need to announce discipline to people who had none left. Silence replaced order. Some people broke. They screamed in the streets. They attacked guards. They tried to force open gates. These attempts ended quickly. Not because the city was strong, but because it had learned to suppress chaos efficiently. Even at the end, order mattered. Time also eroded loyalty. People began to think in smaller units. Households, families, individuals. The city as a whole felt abstract. Survival was personal now. When surrender finally came, it did not feel dramatic. No banners fell, no walls collapsed. The gates opened slowly, almost apologetically. Inside, people did not cheer. By the time hunger had hollowed the city, something else began to take its place. Suspicion. It crept through streets as quietly as hunger had, settling into homes, into conversations, into the spaces between neighbors who once trusted each other without thinking. At first, it was subtle. A glance held a second too long. A door closed more quickly than usual. A question asked with too much care. Who still has food? Who looks less thin than the rest? Who is surviving too well? During a siege, survival itself becomes suspicious. People notice details they would once have ignored. The smell of cooking where no ration should allow it. Children who cried less at night. Faces that did not sink as quickly as others. The city had begun to watch itself. Officials encouraged this, not openly. But quietly, they asked citizens to report hoarding, to report private baking, to report anyone breaking ration laws. It was framed as fairness. It rarely felt that way. Public punishments returned. Not often, just enough. A man dragged into the square for hiding grain. A woman accused of feeding her family secretly. A household fined, then stripped of its remaining supplies. The city needed examples. Fear still worked, even when hunger dulled everything else. At night, people whispered about informers. Who might be listening? Which walls were too thin? Conversations shortened. Silence spread. Children were warned not to talk. Not because they might lie, but because they might tell the truth. Truth had become dangerous. The city also began to fracture along old lines. Wealth, trade, religion, origin. People retreated into familiar groups. Foreigners were watched closely. The poor were blamed easily. The sick were avoided entirely. The siege sharpened differences that peace had softened. Illness now spread faster. Not because it was new, but because people hid it. To admit sickness meant isolation. Isolation meant fewer rations. Fewer rations meant death. So people coughed into sleeves. They hid fevers. They slept next to others anyway. Disease thrived on secrecy. The dead accumulated faster. Burials became hurried. Graves shallow. Sometimes, bodies were left until morning. No one wanted to walk the streets at night anymore. The darkness felt heavier now. Not threatening, accusing. Faith returned with intensity. People prayed loudly again. Processions were organized. Relics were carried through streets already thick with sickness. Hope needed a form. Religion offered one. Others turned away from faith entirely. They had prayed before. The walls were still closed. The food was still gone. Some people stopped believing. Some believed harder. Both were desperate. Rumors filled the silence. The enemy poisoned the wells. The council was lying. Certain families were protected. None could be proven. All were believed. The city council lost authority slowly, not through rebellion, through irrelevance. People stopped expecting solutions. They stopped listening. Decisions were still made, but fewer people cared. Guards deserted their posts. Not openly, quietly. They found excuses. They were sick. They were needed at home. They simply did not return. The walls still stood, but fewer eyes watched them. Crime increased. Not theft. There was little left to steal. Violence. Arguments escalated quickly. Disputes ended with injuries. There was no energy left for restraint. The city tried to respond. Curfews tightened again. Weapons were restricted. But enforcement was thin. The guards were hungry too. Inside homes, families changed. Authority shifted. The strongest voice led, not the wisest. Those who could still act took control. Children grew quieter. They learned not to demand. They learned not to ask. People began to imagine betrayal everywhere. Was the enemy planning an assault? Was someone preparing to open the gates? Fear became directionless, and directionless fear turns inward. There were accusations, sometimes formal, sometimes violent. A neighbor blamed for sickness. A merchant accused of hiding supplies. A stranger beaten because he looked wrong. The city devoured itself. At night, fires burned longer than they should have. People were careless now. Carelessness was not rebellion. It was exhaustion. The soundscape of the city changed. Less coughing, less talking, more crying, more silence. Some people tried to escape again. Not through the gates, through tunnels, through sewers, through forgotten passages. Few succeeded. Those caught disappeared, quietly. The city no longer felt like a collective. It felt like a container. People shared space, not purpose. Outside the walls, the attackers noticed something else. Signals, lights at odd hours, movements that didn't align. The city was no longer unified. It was vulnerable. This was the stage attackers waited for. Not hunger, not fear, division. Because walls protect only as long as the people behind them believe in each other. Once that belief breaks, the city has already fallen. Inside, people sensed this too. They did not say it. They felt it. The city no longer felt safe. Not because of the enemy, but because of what they had become. This is when sieges truly ended, not when gates fell, but when trust did. And as the city turned inward, the enemy did nothing. They didn't need to. Time had already done the work. By the time the city reached this stage, the siege was no longer something happening to it. It was something happening within it. The enemy outside the walls had become almost irrelevant. People spoke of them less, thought of them less. The real danger now lived inside the city. Hunger no longer announced itself loudly. It settled into the body and stayed. People learned how to move slowly, how to conserve energy, how to exist on less than they believed possible. Conversations shortened because words required effort. Emotions dulled because feeling required fuel. This was not despair. It was adaptation. Meals became symbolic. A crust of bread shared among many. A thin soup meant to feel warm rather than filling. Eating was no longer pleasure. It was proof of continuation. People stopped standing upright when they could avoid it. They sat. They leaned. They rested wherever possible. Even posture changed under siege. Time lost its shape. Days blurred together. Weeks felt identical. Without festivals, without work, without progress, time became a loop. Morning meant hunger. Night meant waiting. Nothing marked improvement. Only decline. Moral boundaries softened first, then dissolved. Acts that once carried shame became practical decisions. Stealing from the dead. Taking food meant for the sick. Leaving someone behind because they could not walk. These were not committed with malice. They were committed with exhaustion. People stopped apologizing. There was no point. Everyone understood. The sick were avoided completely now, not quietly, openly. If someone coughed too long, neighbors moved away. If a fever lasted more than a day, doors stayed closed. Care had become dangerous. Those who fell ill alone often stayed that way. Not because no one cared, but because caring could kill. Doctors stopped visiting houses individually. They gathered the sick together instead, not to heal, to contain. The word was never spoken aloud. Death became ordinary. Bodies were carried through streets without ceremony, sometimes without names. Graves were reused. Markers were forgotten. The city could no longer afford memory. Children adapted faster than adults. They cried less. They spoke less. They watched. They learned which expressions brought food, which questions brought silence. Childhood shrank. Older people faded, not dramatically, gradually. They stopped eating, stopped moving, eventually stopped waking. Their deaths were expected, almost planned. The city council barely met anymore. There was nothing left to decide. Rations could not be stretched further. Rules could not be enforced better. The city had reached its limit. The idea of surrender returned, not as debate, as inevitability. People whispered about it without anger now. Surrender was no longer betrayal. It was relief. But even surrender required strength. Strength to open gates. Strength to face the enemy. Strength to survive what came next. Not everyone had that strength left. Some people simply waited. They lay down and waited. Not dramatically. Quietly. They stopped eating when food arrived. Stopped responding when spoken to. This was not suicide. It was resignation. At night, the city barely slept. Not because of fear, because sleep requires safety. And no one felt safe anymore. The walls still stood, but they felt meaningless. Stone cannot protect a city that has already broken apart. Inside homes, families reorganized again. Leadership passed to whoever could still act. Compassion gave way to efficiency. The weakest voice no longer decided anything. This was not cruelty. It was selection. Outside, the attackers noticed a change. No movement on the walls at certain hours. No signals returned. The city was conserving energy. That meant it was close. The attackers prepared. Quietly. They repaired equipment, sharpened blades, not for battle, but for occupation. Inside, rumors spread about what would happen after surrender. Some believed mercy awaited, others feared slaughter. No one knew. No one had the energy to imagine anymore. This uncertainty did not cause panic. Panic requires hope. The city had none left. Animals disappeared completely. First pets, then working animals. Horses were slaughtered last. Not out of sentiment, out of necessity. They were valuable and edible. The smell of the city changed one final time. It was no longer hunger. It was decay, not rot, but stagnation. The smell of something that had stopped functioning. People avoided mirrors. Faces had become unfamiliar, eyes sunken, skin stretched. They did not recognize themselves. Identity dissolved. People were no longer bakers or merchants or guards. They were mouths, bodies, numbers. This was the final transformation of a besieged city. It did not fall. It emptied itself. When the gates finally opened, they did so without ceremony. No cheers, no speeches. Just movement. Slow, careful. The enemy entered cautiously. They expected resistance. There was none. They found a city that had already surrendered to time. The siege had ended long before the gates opened. It ended the moment survival replaced humanity as the city's highest value. And in that moment, the city was already lost. The first thing the attackers noticed was not silence. It was the lack of reaction. When soldiers stepped through the open gates, they expected something: fear, anger, resistance, pleading. Instead, they found people who barely looked up. Faces turned toward them slowly, without urgency, without surprise. The city had already imagined this moment too many times to feel anything new. Occupation did not begin with violence. It began with assessment. Soldiers walked the streets counting bodies, not enemies. They noted which houses were empty, which wells still worked, which buildings were beyond repair. This was not conquest. It was inventory. Inside homes, families waited. Not hiding, not resisting. Waiting to be told what came next. Because choice had been exhausted long ago. Some people were relieved. Not openly. Relief felt dangerous now. But internally, the waiting was over. The uncertainty had ended. Whatever came next would be different. And different was better than endless sameness. Others felt nothing at all. They watched soldiers pass as if watching weather. Another force moving through their lives, no more personal than hunger or disease. The attackers issued rules quickly. Curfews, movement restrictions, food control. The city recognized these immediately. They were familiar. Siege rules had prepared people for occupation without realizing it. Food arrived slowly. Not abundance, just enough to remind people what full felt like. Bodies reacted badly at first. Stomachs rejected sudden nourishment. Illness spiked. Survival had reshaped them too deeply. Some people died after the siege ended, not during the worst of it. After. Their bodies could not adjust. Time had already claimed them. Families reunited unevenly. Some found relatives alive when they had assumed them dead. Others discovered absences that would never be explained. The city did not help them grieve. There was too much to rebuild. The attackers did not destroy what remained. They used it. Stables became barracks. Storehouses became command posts. Homes were requisitioned without ceremony. The city continued, just under new management. People adapted again. They always did. Survival had trained them well. They learned new rules, new dangers, new silences. Occupation was different from siege, but it still required restraint. Those who had suffered most often survived longest afterward. They had already shed unnecessary attachments. Hope, expectation, certainty. They lived day by day without imagining improvement. This made them resilient. Those who had hoarded or hidden resources during the siege often fared worse. Resentment followed them. Occupation exposes memory. People remember who ate well while others starved. Justice came quietly. Not officially, but effectively. The city began to change shape again. Streets reopened. Markets returned in fragments. Noise slowly crept back. But it was never the same city. Something essential had been removed. People spoke differently now. More carefully. Less often. Words had proven unreliable during the siege. Silence had kept them alive. Children grew up quickly in the aftermath. They remembered hunger better than faces. They played games about hiding food, about waiting, about counting. The siege became their baseline. Years later, the city would tell stories about the siege. Not detailed ones, simple ones. We survived. It was hard. We lost many. The truth was too complex, too uncomfortable. No one spoke about the moments when they had chosen themselves over others. No one spoke about doors that stayed closed. Those memories lived quietly, shaping behavior without explanation. The city rebuilt physically faster than it healed socially. Walls were repaired, houses reconstructed. Trust did not return as easily. People learned something fundamental during the siege. That civilization is thin. that order depends on abundance, that morality bends under pressure, and that survival does not require dignity. This knowledge did not make them cruel, it made them cautious. The city continued, as cities always do. Generations passed. New people filled old streets. The siege became history. But the patterns remained, in how food was stored, in how doors were closed at night, in how quickly people withdrew when crisis threatened. The city remembered, even if no one spoke of it. This is what happened inside a city during a medieval siege. Not constant fighting, not heroic last stands, but slow erosion of strength, of trust, of humanity. The walls did their job. They kept the enemy out. But they could not protect the people from time. Time entered the city anyway, through hunger, through fear, through waiting. And once it was inside, it did not leave until everything had changed. The siege ended. The city survived, but the version of it that existed before the gates closed was gone forever. And that is the quiet truth of sieges. They do not just conquer cities, they transform them, silently, long after the banners are taken down and the camps outside the walls dissolve into memory. The transformation remains. It lingers in habits that no one remembers learning, in doors that are closed a little earlier than necessary, in food that is stored even when there is plenty, in the instinct to wait rather than act. The city moves again, but it moves differently. People speak of the siege as an event that ended, a chapter that closed, a hardship that passed. But for those who lived inside the walls, it never truly ended. It simply changed form. Survival leaves residue. Those who endured learned lessons that peace does not erase. They learned how quickly order collapses when resources vanish, how thin the line is between cooperation and suspicion, how easily morality bends when hunger speaks louder than rules. These lessons were not written down. They were absorbed, passed from parent to child without explanation, reinforced by silence rather than stories. In rebuilt markets, people still weighed bread carefully, not because they needed to, but because once, weight had meant life. In restored homes, families still gathered close at night, listening for sounds that no longer mattered. In moments of crisis, even minor ones, people still looked inward first, toward family, toward household, toward self. The city had learned where help did not come from. Time softened the edges of memory, but it did not erase its shape. New generations walked streets unaware of what had happened there. Yet their behavior was guided by it all the same. They inherited caution without knowing its origin, restraint without understanding its cause. This is how history survives, not in records, not in monuments, but in instinct. Sieges do not leave ruins alone. They leave altered people, people who understand that protection can fail, that walls can become traps, that endurance is often mistaken for virtue, and that surviving something does not mean it did not take something from you. The city eventually tells a simpler story, that it resisted, that it endured, that it survived. It does not speak of the nights when doors stayed closed, of the meals skipped deliberately, of the moments when compassion became too expensive. Those truths are heavier. What remains is a city that looks whole, but remembers fracture, a city that knows silence, that respects scarcity, that understands waiting, a city that learned, once and forever, that time is not neutral. Time chooses sides, and during a siege, it always chooses against those trapped inside. This is what happened inside a city during a medieval siege. Not constant violence, not endless battle, but a slow reshaping of human behavior under pressure so steady that it felt natural, until it was over. And even then, it never truly was, because cities recover, Stones are replaced, roofs rebuilt, streets repaved. But the quiet knowledge remains that when the gates close and the world shrinks, survival will ask for more than strength. It will ask for patience, for sacrifice, for silence, and it will take those things without asking. That is the legacy of sieges, not the fall of walls, but the lasting change of the people who lived behind them. Long after the siege is remembered as history, it continues as behavior. The people who lived through it did not talk about lessons learned. They lived them. They became careful without knowing why, suspicious without admitting it, prepared without remembering the cause. The siege left the city before it left the people. In the years that followed, life slowly returned to its familiar shape. Markets reopened, crafts resumed, festivals were announced again. But participation felt different. Crowds gathered, yet people stood closer to exits. Food was shared, yet portions were watched. Laughter returned, but it did not linger as long. The city had learned how quickly everything could be taken away. And that knowledge never truly faded. Children born after the siege inherited its consequences without explanation. They were taught not to waste food. Even when food was plentiful, they were told to obey curfews that no longer mattered. They learned that doors should always be secured at night. When they asked why, adults gave vague answers. It's safer this way. It's better to be careful. You never know. The real answer was harder to explain. Some families thrived after the siege. They adapted quickly to new rulers, new systems, new demands. Their flexibility was mistaken for loyalty. Others never recovered. They remained poor, cautious, inward-looking. They trusted slowly and forgave rarely. The siege did not end inequality. It sharpened it. The city rebuilt its walls. Higher in some places, thicker in others. From the outside, it looked stronger. From the inside, it felt tighter. Walls no longer represented protection alone. They represented memory. Every crisis afterward was measured against the siege. A bad harvest? At least it's not like before. A short illness. We survived worse. This comparison comforted some and haunted others. Because survival does not feel like victory when it costs too much. The siege also changed how the city understood authority. Leaders were no longer trusted blindly. Orders were followed, but watched closely. People learned that those in power ration differently when they are not hungry themselves. That lesson remained. Quiet. Persistent. Religion absorbed the siege and reshaped itself around it. Some faiths grew stronger, emphasizing endurance and obedience. Others fractured, burdened by unanswered prayers. Both responses made sense. Both were scars. There were anniversaries, at first. Years when bells rang softly to mark the end of suffering. Years when candles were lit for the dead. Over time, these faded. Memory needs repetition to survive, and repetition requires energy. Eventually, the siege became something people knew about, not something they felt. Almost. Because when danger returned, and it always does, the city responded faster than expected. People stocked food early. Movement slowed sooner. Trust contracted immediately. The city remembered how to survive, even when it did not remember why. This is how extreme events persist. Not as stories, as instincts. The siege also altered how people understood each other. They had seen neighbors at their worst. And themselves. They knew what hunger could do, what fear could justify. This knowledge did not destroy community. It made it cautious. Forgiveness became conditional, kindness strategic, not because people were cruel, but because they had learned the cost of generosity when resources vanish. Years later, travelers passed through the city and remarked on its order. How quiet it was at night. How disciplined the people seemed. How little waste they produced. They mistook restraint for virtue. They did not see the fear beneath it. The siege also left gaps in records, names missing, entire households erased. History rarely explains these absences. It simply moves on. Those gaps mattered. Not because of who was lost, but because of who learned to live without them. Over generations, the siege became a reference point, a warning spoken vaguely. A city once starved. A time when things were worse. Children listened without understanding. Adults spoke without detail. The truth remained too heavy. This is how trauma becomes culture. It stops being a memory and starts being a rule. The city survived its siege. That much was true. But survival is not the same as preservation. Something essential had been altered, something human. The siege taught the city that abundance is temporary, trust is fragile, immorality bends under pressure. And time is the most powerful weapon of all. These lessons did not fade. They settled. Centuries later, when historians wrote about the siege, they focused on numbers. How long it lasted. How many died. Who won. They missed the quiet aftermath. The way people changed. Because the true outcome of a siege is not decided when gates open. It is decided in the years after. In habits formed. In fears inherited. In instincts passed down silently. This is what happened inside a city during a medieval siege. Not just starvation. Not just waiting. Not just surrender. But a slow, permanent shift in how people understood survival. The city endured. But it never forgot. Even when it believed it had.